This is a fictional story inspired by common property disputes and HOA conflicts. 3 days, that's all it took for an entire neighborhood to decide I was the villain. On Monday morning, 83 kids stood outside a locked chain-link fence staring through it like somebody had canceled Christmas. Parents were yelling, phones were recording, and one woman pointed right at me across the street and shouted, "You should be ashamed of yourself." The funny part, I almost believed her for a second, because nobody watching that scene knew the one little detail that changed everything. The playground behind that fence wasn't on HOA land. It was sitting right in the middle of mine. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 36 years old. I work as a cybersecurity consultant, and if you'd asked anyone who knew me before all this happened, they'd probably tell you I avoid conflict whenever possible. I like computers because they make sense. You follow the rules, you find the bug, you fix the problem. People don't work that way. They make assumptions, double down on them, and somehow convince themselves that confidence is the same thing as being right. I bought my corner lot outside Asheville years before the subdivision around it exploded with new construction. It wasn't a huge piece of land, just enough open space that I figured maybe someday I'd build a small workshop or even a little house to rent out. Until then, it was nothing but grass, a couple old maple trees, and a mailbox that mostly collected flyers from lawn care companies. Then work sent me overseas for almost 10 months. Long hours, different time zones, airports every few weeks. Honestly, I barely had time to think about home beyond making sure the property taxes were paid automatically. My neighbor, an older guy named Frank, would occasionally text me that everything looked fine. Looking back now, I realize he always meant my house looked fine. Nobody ever mentioned the empty lot. The first hint that something was wrong came before I even unpacked my suitcase. I was driving home from the grocery store when I noticed bright blue plastic peeking over the hill where my lot should have been. At first, I thought maybe the county had staged construction equipment nearby, but as I got closer, I saw a swing set, then a slide, then one of those colorful rubber safety surfaces kids bounce across. I actually slowed my truck because I thought my GPS had somehow taken me onto the wrong street. It hadn't. I pulled over, climbed out, and just stood there with grocery bags hanging from both hands while about 60 children ran around laughing on land I had owned for almost 8 years. There were picnic tables, benches, shade sails, even one of those little splash pads with water shooting out of the ground. Parents sat under umbrellas drinking iced coffee like this place had been there forever. One little boy waved at me and asked if I wanted to race him down the slide. I smiled without saying anything because my brain had completely stopped working. Across the entrance hung a wooden sign painted with cheerful colors. Willow Creek Community Park, sponsored by the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I remember laughing, not because anything was funny, but because sometimes your mind refuses to accept what your eyes are telling you. I kept waiting for somebody to walk over and explain there had been a mistake. Maybe the developer had bought my lot years ago, and I'd somehow missed the paperwork. Instead, people walked past me like I was the one who didn't belong there. That evening, I dug through every file I had. Closing documents, property tax records, survey drawings, the original plat map. Everything matched exactly what I'd remembered. The lot still belonged to me. Nothing had changed. The next morning, I drove to the county records office hoping somebody would tell me I was wrong. Believe it or not, I wanted to be wrong. Owning a piece of land with a playground built on top of it sounded less like good fortune and more like the beginning of a migraine that could last years. The survey technician looked over my documents, pulled up the digital parcel map, zoomed in, then looked at me over his glasses. "Whoever built on this," he said quietly, "should have hired a surveyor first." He printed updated maps showing every property line. The playground wasn't barely over the boundary. It wasn't close enough to argue about. Nearly the entire thing sat well inside my parcel. Whoever planned the project had somehow confused the drainage easement with the actual lot line, and nobody had bothered to verify ownership before pouring concrete. I thanked him, rolled up the maps, and sat in my truck for almost half an hour thinking about what to do next. I wasn't angry yet, mostly confused. I kept wondering how dozens of adults, contractors, board members, architects, inspectors, donors, and volunteers could all participate in building something that expensive without one person asking the simplest question in real estate. Who owns the land? Frank wandered over while I was staring at the maps and leaned against my truck. "You finally saw it, huh?" he asked. I nodded. Why didn't anybody call me? He shrugged with the kind of uncomfortable smile people wear when they know the answer won't make you feel better. Most folks assumed the board had already worked everything out. Once construction started, people stopped asking questions. Then he hesitated before adding something that stuck with me. Not everybody was comfortable with it, Ethan. Some of us just figured somebody smarter than us had checked the paperwork. That's the thing about communities. Responsibility gets spread so thin that eventually nobody feels responsible for anything. Later that afternoon, I looked up the HOA board online. Their president was Linda Mercer, a retired school principal who'd become something of a local celebrity inside the subdivision. Every newsletter featured her smiling beside flower beds, charity drives, neighborhood cleanups, always talking about bringing families together. Building a playground had become her signature project. The community had raised almost $100,000 for it through events, donations, and increased association dues. Looking at those smiling photos, I realized something important. If I handled this the wrong way, I wouldn't just be fighting a homeowners association. I'd be standing against a story people desperately wanted to believe, and stories are a lot harder to defeat than facts. The next morning, I drafted what was probably the calmest email I'd ever written. I attached the county parcel map, highlighted the property lines, introduced myself, and explained that the playground appeared to have been constructed entirely on my privately owned lot. I even ended the message with, "I'm sure this is an honest mistake, and I'm happy to meet whenever it's convenient so we can figure out the best solution together." I hit send, leaned back in my chair, and honestly expected a phone call before lunch. Instead, nothing. No reply that day. None the next day either. By Friday, I sent a second email, this time attaching a copy of my deed along with the original survey from when I purchased the property. Again, silence. A week later, I left a voicemail. Then another. Finally, I received a short email from Linda Mercer that simply read, "The community park was approved by the board and all required procedures were followed." That was it. No questions. No request to see my documents. Not even an acknowledgement that I claimed to own the land beneath the playground. I read that sentence 3 times before I laughed to myself. It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. So I stopped trying to convince people emotionally and started documenting everything instead. My title insurance company reviewed the records and confirmed exactly what the county surveyor had already told me. The improvements sat inside my parcel. From a legal standpoint, the playground represented an unauthorized structure on private property, and because children were using it every afternoon, there was another issue nobody on the board seemed eager to discuss. Liability. If someone got seriously hurt, lawyers wouldn't just be asking who built the playground. They'd ask who owned the land underneath it. That name was mine. Suddenly, this wasn't just about a boundary dispute. It was about protecting myself before someone else's mistake became my financial nightmare. I hired a real estate attorney named Melissa Grant, the kind of attorney who spoke softly enough that people underestimated her until she started citing statutes from memory. She listened without interrupting, flipped through my paperwork, then asked one question. "Do you actually want the playground removed?" I stared out her office window before answering. "Honestly, no. The kids didn't do anything wrong." She nodded. "Good. Because that's exactly how we'll approach this." Over the next several days, she prepared a formal notice explaining the ownership issue, requesting immediate discussions, and outlining the potential liability concerns. Certified mail, email, courier delivery. Every box was checked. 11 days passed. No meeting. No phone call. Instead, the HOA newsletter came out celebrating record attendance at the playground and thanking Linda for creating a lasting gift for future generations. My lot appeared in full-color photographs. My land. Printed in glossy paper and mailed to hundreds of families as though it belonged to someone else. That was the moment something changed inside me. Up until then, I'd been patient because I believed someone would eventually look at the facts and say, "We messed up." Instead, they kept acting like repeating the same story would somehow erase the property lines recorded at the county courthouse. Melissa called me that afternoon. "Have they responded?" Not a word. She paused for a second. "Then it's time to secure your property." We spent another week making sure every legal requirement had been satisfied. Notices were mailed. Deadlines expired. Local authorities were informed that access to private property would soon be restricted. Even then, I barely slept the night before. I kept asking myself whether there had to be another way. But every alternative ended with the same question. What happens if a child gets injured tomorrow? By sunrise on Saturday, 2 trucks pulled onto the lot carrying fencing materials. The crew worked efficiently, measuring each corner against the survey stakes before setting steel posts into the ground. I stood nearby with copies of the survey rolled under my arm, while curious neighbors gathered across the street. One woman walked over and asked, "What exactly is going on?" I handed her the county map without saying much. 5 minutes later, she quietly returned it and walked away. Around noon, Linda's SUV pulled into the parking area. She climbed out, already angry. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Securing my property," I answered. "You're fencing in a community park." "No," I said calmly. "I'm fencing my land. The park just happens to be sitting on it." She waved her hand dismissively. "This playground exists because families came together. You're really going to destroy that?" I shook my head. "I haven't damaged a single swing, slide, or bench. I'm protecting property you built without permission." She took one step closer. "You can't seriously expect children to pay for paperwork." "Neither should I," I replied. She didn't answer. She simply turned around, got back into her SUV, and drove away before the fence was finished. By late afternoon, the entire playground sat behind an 8-foot chain-link fence with clearly visible private property and no trespassing signs posted around the perimeter. It looked strange, almost surreal, like a perfectly preserved museum exhibit that nobody could enter. Sunday passed quietly. I spent most of the day wondering if maybe the board would finally call. They didn't. Monday morning arrived with school buses, bicycles, minivans, and the normal routine of suburban life, until the first group of children reached the locked entrance. They stopped. One little girl tugged on the chain wrapped around the gate. Another boy looked through the fence toward the swings. Within minutes, parents began arriving. Confused conversations turned into raised voices. Someone recognized me standing near my truck. "Did you do this?" a father shouted from across the street. "Yes," I answered. "Why would you lock kids out?" another parent demanded. Before I could explain, Linda appeared, walking quickly toward the crowd. She pointed directly at me. "He's refusing to cooperate." That sentence spread through the gathering faster than anything I could have said. Phones came out. Videos started recording. People assumed the story before asking for one. Then a gray-haired man I'd never met raised his hand and called out, "Did anybody actually check whether the land belongs to him?" The crowd went quiet for just a moment. Linda answered immediately, "That's being reviewed." I almost smiled because for the first time she hadn't claimed the land was theirs. She'd admitted, however carefully, that there was something to review. It was a tiny crack in a story that had sounded unshakable only days before. The rest of the week became absolute chaos. Neighborhood social media pages exploded. Half the comments called me selfish, heartless, greedy, every name you could imagine. The other half started posting screenshots from county records, survey maps, and property databases anyone could access online. People who had donated money to the project suddenly began asking uncomfortable questions. Who approved construction? Was a survey ever completed? Did anyone verify ownership? Why hadn't the board responded to documented evidence? Those questions spread much faster than accusations ever could. By Friday evening, I realized something important. The argument was no longer about a locked playground. It had become a debate about accountability, and for the first time since I'd returned home, the conversation had finally shifted away from emotion and toward facts. The following Monday, my attorney called before I even finished my first cup of coffee. "You're going to like this," Melissa said. "Their lawyer wants a meeting." I didn't celebrate. After everything that had happened, I knew better than to mistake a meeting for an apology. We met 2 days later in a conference room at a small law office downtown. Linda sat at one end of the table looking far more tired than the confident woman from the neighborhood newsletters. Across from her was the HOA's attorney, who spent more time looking at the survey maps than at me. Nobody argued about where the property line was anymore. That battle was over before the meeting even started. The only question left was what happened next. The attorney cleared his throat. The association would like to purchase the parcel. He slid a written offer across the table. I looked at the number, folded the paper once, and set it back down. "I'm not interested in selling." Linda finally spoke. "Name your price." I shook my head. "It isn't about the price." She frowned. "Then what is it about?" I took a slow breath before answering. For almost a month, I tried to solve this quietly. I sent emails, documents, surveys, certified letters. Nobody wanted to hear me until there was a fence around the playground. If I sell today, the lesson everyone learns is that ignoring the owner eventually works. The room fell silent. Melissa leaned forward. My client is willing to consider a long-term lease instead. That got their attention. I explained exactly what I had in mind. The HOA could continue using the playground so the children wouldn't lose it. They would lease the land under a recorded agreement, make monthly payments, carry full insurance, maintain every piece of equipment, install security cameras, and accept responsibility for repairs and future liability associated with the improvements. If they ever stopped paying or violated the agreement, access to the property could be suspended until the issue was corrected. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was making sure the ownership of the land would never again become something people simply assumed away. Linda stared at the proposal for a long time before quietly asking, "You planned this?" I smiled a little. No, I planned for someone to answer my first email. A week later, the board held a special meeting. This time it wasn't filled with speeches about community spirit or ribbon-cutting ceremonies. Residents wanted answers. Some were angry with me, but many were angrier that the situation had been allowed to reach this point at all. Several families admitted they had donated because they believed every legal step had already been completed. Others questioned why independent surveys hadn't been ordered before construction began. The debate lasted for hours. In the end, the board voted to approve the lease. It wasn't unanimous, but it didn't need to be. The documents were signed the following Friday. A few days later, the first payment arrived exactly when it was supposed to. The fence came open that afternoon. Kids ran inside as if nothing had happened. Their laughter echoed across the grass while parents settled back onto the benches. And for the first time since coming home, I didn't feel angry. Mostly I felt relieved. The playground had never been my enemy. Neither were the children. The real problem had been the belief that good intentions somehow erased responsibility. They don't. Good intentions can build wonderful things, but they still have to respect someone else's rights along the way. Every now and then I still see Linda around the neighborhood. We nod politely. We've never become friends, but we're no longer enemies either. Time has a funny way of sanding down sharp edges. As for me, I still drive past the playground from time to time. I see birthday parties, little league celebrations, grandparents pushing swings, and kids chasing each other across the same rubber surface that almost became the center of a lawsuit. I'm genuinely glad they have that place. I just smile knowing the story underneath it is very different from the one most people first believed. Whenever someone says, "It's just an empty lot," I can't help laughing to myself because empty doesn't mean abandoned, and available doesn't mean free. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes begin with a simple assumption that nobody bothers to verify. So here's what I still wonder. If you had been in my position after weeks of being ignored, insulted, and blamed for a problem you didn't create, would you have sold the land, demanded the playground be removed, or done exactly what I did? Let me know down in the comments, because I've learned that people can look at the exact same situation and come away with completely different ideas about fairness, responsibility, and justice. If you enjoyed this fictional story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your opinion below. I'd love to hear which side you would have taken, and whether you think the neighborhood learned the right lesson in the end.